Hi everyone, it's Kathleen. We are here today for an episode of Stitch Play. I am wanting to practice some stitches to create stems with for flowers in my country cottage block for the Journal of Stitchery. So today I'd like to practice the Portuguese knotted stem stitch, and it makes a very delicate, dainty, very pretty stem stitch. So what I'm going to do is start. I'm using a number 5 pearl cotton because that's just what I like to practice with. And like a stem stitch, you just bring your thread to the front. The thread always stays to the bottom, below the working line. My working line is this little stem, which will be a flower to that circle. So, and I always work with a milliner's needle. That's just my choice because it's long for me to, I have lots to hang on to. My thumb lets go occasionally, and it has a nice large eye for me to fit my pearl cotton through. So on with the Portuguese knotted stem stitch. So for a normal stem stitch, you would, and here, this is where I have to practice keeping my stitches equidistant apart. For me, that's the hardest part of stitching. So for a stem stitch, you go down into the fabric, and usually you come up very close, if not in the same hole that you came out of. So that would be a stem stitch. But to start off this Portuguese knotted stem stitch, you're going to go back a little bit. It's about 1/3 away from where you came out. And then you pull your thread through. Then you're going to take your needle. I always take my blunt end, which is my eye, because I don't want to catch any of my fabric or the threads with my pointy needle. So with the eye of my needle, I am going to go in between where I came out the first time and where I came out the second time. So I'm going to stick my needle in between there and pull it through. I'm making one knot, and then I'm going to make sure my thread is out of the way, and I'm going to stick my needle in the same spot a second time and make a knot. The knot will fall underneath that knot. So again, you're going to bring your, that's the first part of your stitch, or the first stitch, I should say, your first stitch. Bring your thread below your working area and take, now you're going to, from now on, you're going to do the same type of stitch. You're going to take a bite, but your bite will be this full length of this full empty spot. So you come up into the same hole that is right here. So it's like you're creating a stem stitch. You create a stem stitch, and then you create 2 knots. Now the knot now will be where this thread comes out and where these knots are. So it's underneath these 2 lines of thread. Oops, let me just double check that. Yes, that's correct. So there's 2 threads here, and you're going to make 2 knots under there. So 1 knot and 2 knots. And you make sure that this little thread loops together there. So now that's a second stitch made. So every stitch will be made exactly like this. We're going to take a bite and come up where the thread is and pull through. That's a stem stitch. So the Portuguese knotted stem stitch, you take your back of your needle and you just make 2 knots underneath those 2 lines, those 2 threads. So that's 1 and 2. Bring your working thread down, take a bite, come up where the thread comes out, and just pull that through. So this is a basic stem stitch. And now we take the back of the needle and we make 2 knots underneath those 2 threads. 1 and 2. Bring our thread, working thread, below our line. Take a bite, come up where that thread comes out, and just pull it through. You make 2 knots underneath those 2 threads. 1 and 2. And you make sure that the second knot is underneath it, or like to the left side of that. And that, can you see how pretty that is, making a nice delicate little arced shape, almost a chain stitch with a knot on the one side of it? It's very, very pretty and very dainty. I'm going to be using this Portuguese knotted stem stitch in my country cottage block that I'm doing for the Journal of Stitchery. So let's keep going all the way up. We're going to take a bite and we're going to come out where the thread comes out. Take the eye of our needle and we're going to go under to make 1 knot and under again to make a second knot. And you just want to make sure your knot lies next to it to the left. And remember to bring your thread down. And you're making a stem stitch. And pull through. Eye of the needle, 2 knots. 1 and we have to make sure the second knot, you see how I'm pulling it to the left so it lies to the left, and then you can always just scooch it up together nice and snug so they're nice and together. Bring your thread always down, because if you don't, it'll look different. Stem stitch, then 2 knots. 1 and 2. Bring your thread down. Stem stitch. Pull it snug and eye of the needle under the 2 threads to make 2 knots. And make sure that that knot is sitting to the left of it snugly. And then you see how pretty that's looking? So let's do that again. I'm working on a wool fabric just because I like working with wool. So let's make a stem stitch and 2 knots. First knot, second knot, thread down, stem stitch, and 2 knots. Thread down. See my thumb let go. And stem stitch. And 2 knots. Thread down. I'm going to dangle my thread because it was a little bit twisted. Thread down. Stem stitch. And 2 knots. Thread down. This is going to be my last one, so watch how I finish this last one off. You take a stem stitch, take a bite for a stem stitch, and you do the same thing with the first knot. And then this second, instead of taking a second knot, you are just going to anchor your thread down. There we are, and that is the Portuguese knotted stem stitch. I'm going to be using this in some of the stems of my flowers in my country cottage. I also want to see what it's going to look like around this circle. So that's why I call this stitch play. So let's start. Let's come up. I'm going to come up at the base of this stitch that I just started, and I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do it on the outside on this gray wool. So I'm going to do my stitch on the outside of this circle all the right way around, just to see what it looks like. So again, with this first stitch, instead of coming all the way to the thread, you just want to give yourself a little room. So it's about coming not halfway, you're only about 1/3 of the way. So make a stem stitch. And then you're going to go underneath. It's in between where you came out and where you came out. So it's a small little space, and you're going to make 2 knots. 1 and 2. Now thread down, and we're going to make the same stitch all the way around, which is your bite is going to be a stem stitch, and then your needle goes under those 2 threads. So where the knot is, I hold it with my nail, and I go underneath those 2 threads, 1 and 2. Thread down. Let's make a stem stitch. And you see how my nail holds my knots, and I go under those 2 threads, making sure those 2 threads lie side by side. Bring your thread down and make a stem stitch and 2 knots. So I'm holding my knot with my nail, and I'm going underneath those 2 threads. And I don't have too much thread here, so let's try it. 1 more stitch, stem stitch, and where these 2 are crossing, you go under, and okay, I don't have much thread here, so I'm going to anchor off. So I'm going to go down, and I'm going to make a knot in the back. Whoops, see, my needle went right through my thread, and I don't want that. So I'm going to make a knot. And because I have 2 layers of fabric here, I'm going to anchor my thread in between those two layers and just move it out of the way. And I'm going to cut that off real close to the fabric. Okay, garbage that. And I have another needle threaded already. So we can take this thread, and I've knotted it on the end. And let's, where are we going to come up? Let's come up where that second knot is. That must have been a really large bite. Let's come up where that, okay, where's my knot? My knot is here. And let's come up, let's see. Oh, okay, let's see my knot. Let's squash these little guys together. And let's come up where that second knot is. Because it would be wrapped around and it would come out at the top. Okay, so we're going to continue by taking a bite and making 2 knots under those 2 threads. Bringing the thread down. Taking a bite. And 2 knots under the 2 threads, so 2 knots. Thread down. Taking a bite. Always coming up where that other thread is going into the, so you're doing a stem stitch, and underneath those 2 threads you're going to make two knots. That's 1 knot, 2 knots. You see how I moved that knot over? Okay, and let's keep going. Thread down, stem stitch, and 2 knots, thread down, stem stitch, and 2 knots, thread down, stem stitch, under the 2 threads, so 2 knots, thread down, stem stitch, and you see how I'm kind of pulling my fabric away so I can see where those 2 threads are, because you're going to make a knot under the 2 threads, 1 knot and 2 knots. Thread down, and I'm tangled again, so I'm just going to let it fall. Stem stitch, and 1 knot, 2 knots, thread down, stem stitch, and 2 knots, thread down, So you're making a stem stitch and 2 knots, thread down, stem stitch. Oh, come on. I don't know why it's getting a little difficult. And 2 knots, stem stitch. Oh, come on. And 2 knots. Okay, I might have another. I have enough thread to do 1 more stitch. So this 2 knots. Okay, yes, I have thread to do another stitch yet. So 2 knots. Let's do the last stitch. So stem stitch and 1 knot. And because I'm ending it here, I'm going to move put my thread down where that knot is going to be. And that's the last bit. I have to rethread. I'm going to tie a knot, and then I'm going to hide this thread in between my 2 layers of fabric. And it looks like I need a 3rd piece of pearl cotton and thread, my needle. I'm going to take the end of that thread, hold the end, and go 1, 2, 3, squeeze, and keep squeezing and pull. And then I got my quilter's knot. I'm going to bring this where this went down. Let's have a look. Oh, we want it on the top part of the knot. We want to come out on the top part because that's where, if we were to wrap it, that's where it would come out. Now we're going to start our next stitch by doing a stem stitch, and we're going to continue because we're not starting. When you first start, you leave a little bit of space, but since we're continuing with the line, that's why we're taking a full bite for the stem stitch. And 2 knots, 1 and 2, thread down. It looks like I have 2 more stitches to take. So stem stitch and 1 and 2, thread down, and let's see if this is going to be the last stitch. Take a stem stitch and let's go 1. Looks like I have to do something in here. This looks like quite a big what am I gonna do? Oh, I got 2 knots. How far apart are these knots? This, that. Oh, well, let's just, do I want to end it right there? Let's make, this doesn't look finished to me. I want to bring another one over, so let's just make a second knot. And yeah, see, I need another part of that chain, so let's bring the loop down. So where did where's this? Because we got 2 close knot. I am going to go down where I started, and oh, but that would be okay. I have the 2 spaces there, so I'm going to go down in the second one, and I'm just fudging this. So this is, I don't know if this is the right way or the wrong way, but this is just Kathleen's way of finishing it off. 1. And, oh, the second knot you just anchor down. Oops, let's move it over and down. Okay, that looks like it. I'm going to end it off, and that is it for the Portuguese knotted stem stitch. I'm going to move this inside here and we'll have a look at it. Love the stem. I'm going to be using that in my country cottage, and this is just one way of outlining something on a circle, just like we outlined this with the scrolls stitch. Very nice. Okay, so that is it for the Portuguese knotted stem stitch for today's video of stitch play. Thank you everyone for joining me, and bye for now.